we're talking about media propaganda in terms of war. So modern propaganda in the Western context has its bearings going back to World War I. So almost 100 years under the Wilson administration. World War I had been ensuing in Europe since 1914. And so by the third year, following Wilson's second term, the winning of his second term, promising that he would keep the United States out of war, he plunges us into war very abruptly in April of 1917. So there are certain types of, there are certain rationales that are provided, you know, sinking of the Lusitania and the demonization of the Germans and the like. This is done much as is the case today, by a Democratic administration, by an ostensibly liberal individual, Woodrow Wilson, who assembles a group of progressive journalists to sell the war, called the Committee on Public Information, headed up by George Creel. The individuals who would comprise this panel, this body that would propagandize the American people, were all more or less socialist or liberal journalists. Their types of credentials gave them added credibility in terms of selling the war. So we have people like Edward Bernays, people like Walter Lippmann, Harold Lasswell. All of these people will go on to write about, to expound upon how propaganda can be used to mold public opinion. And their faith in liberal democracy and popular democracy is still formidable up until World War I, when they realized that public opinion can be so malleable as it was in a fairly short period of time, with a sophisticated sort of propaganda campaign that was waged in all types of, this was before cable news and things like that. So you had to recruit public speakers to speak on street corners and in movie theaters called the 4-Minute Men. You had to include Hollywood in this whole process. So it was coming at people from all corners. We have to go and fight the war. We have to fight the war to make the world safe for democracy. That was the motto. And this was overwhelmingly successful. So these individuals really, this called into question their faith in democracy. What are the possibilities of this in what was then termed the Great Society? Well, then propaganda was looked upon as being something that could be used in a benign way to lead the public, because the public could not actually make decisions for itself. This was something that Walter Lippmann described in his book Public Opinion, which was written in 1922, and he had a follow-up written in 1925 called The Phantom Public, where he talks very disparagingly about the possibilities of popular democracy and how political leaders, technocrats, will have to perfect ways to lead public opinion because the public is not capable of making these decisions. And Bernays is making very similar types of arguments in other works, such as a book called Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion. And these are much more practical works that are targeting, they specifically have a readership in mind of practitioners, those who will be involved in public relations. So he develops this notion of the Public Relations Council. And of course he goes on, like Lippmann, to be someone that is involved in, he is a counselor to kings, to heads of state, to heads of the corporate sector, corporations, in terms of how do you get people to do things apart from being overtly propagandistic. Using overtly propagandistic techniques, will you manipulate the culture? So if you get into, if you want for half of the population women to take up smoking, then you have debutantes light up cigarettes in the Easter Day Parade in New York City, and I believe it was 1928 or 1929. Even though this is a propagandistic act, it is presented as news, and so people accept it as being spontaneous or as being genuine, when in fact that is not the case. And now that sort of method was specifically geared towards stimulation of the sale of tobacco, right? But it could be used in terms of promoting a war. There are various types of false flag events that have taken place that we are well aware of. So the Tonkin Gulf is something akin to that particular event, in that it is presented as being a genuine event. It is presented as being spontaneous. And we now know that it was largely contrived. And yet, this is something that sets the wheels turning historically, and it resulted in a war that the U.S. was mired in for 10 years, and several million Southeast Asians were killed as a result of this, not to mention the U.S. service persons, 50,000 plus. So anyway, these types of techniques come to be, they come to take root in propagandistic practices of the state and of the corporate sector from the 1920s onward. And it's also the case, we could also look to, for example, Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese forces. This was something that was prompted. It was something that was provoked largely by the United States. Once again, by a fairly liberal democratic president under FDR. So again, these types of modern techniques have a rootedness that goes back to 1917. And all we have to do really is to look at the writings of these individuals. It's not as if this is sort of secret information. They talk about this explicitly, and how you can more or less hoodwink the public into doing things really that would not be of its choosing if it were given the facts, if it were given all the facts and allowed to actually make decisions that would be to its benefit. So that more or less is a brief overview of the origins of war propaganda. Now, the types of false flag events that have taken place again in more recent in the more recent period include things like the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, which we now know was a false flag operation. The World Trade Center bombing of 1993, and 8 years before the 9/11 terror attacks. We know now that that was something that involved more or less an entrapment by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And a similar sort of scenario in a more complex fashion played out in Oklahoma City in 1995. 9/11. Here is another event, very much more elaborate, with many, many layers, far more sophisticated, but nevertheless a false flag event. I mean, I think that this is beyond demonstrable, a very elaborate event, but nevertheless used to begin to initiate the so-called war on terror, a war that we are told is not going to have any end. There will be no end in sight. It'll be something that we will be fighting indefinitely. So if we want to talk about present history, present geopolitics in any sort of informed way, we cannot dismiss a discussion of 9/11, because this is the propaganda event that set everything in motion. Everything is rooted in that historical event. Now, you take, for example, our sort of intellectual climate in the United States, specifically among journalists, among scholars. This event that I'm participating in tomorrow, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. I can almost assure you, I've not examined the entire schedule thoroughly, but I can almost assure you that there are few, if any, papers examining the propagandistic elements of 9/11, because that's a forbidden event. That's an event that we cannot discuss. I can almost assure you that, with the exception of my paper on the JFK assassination, a particular sort of historical element involving that event, that there's very little, if any, discussion concerning these types of events because they are taboo. Because to discuss these events is to beg the question of the legitimacy of the whole journalistic enterprise in the United States, specifically. And this is something that journalism educators wish to uphold. They wish to uphold this myth of there being a free press. That's not to say that they will not accept criticism of it to some degree, but it is not to the extent that is actually necessary if we were to be honest about the possibilities of journalism. And when I say journalism, I'm not talking about the material that, for example, might be published by global research, which is alternative journalism in many ways. It is something that provides a contrast to mainstream corporate journalism that more or less, informally and in some ways formally, is tethered to the state in terms of upholding these types of narratives, these types of popular myths that we have related to, say, Osama bin Laden or Timothy McVeigh. Again, we are now able to discount to examine and discount the official narratives concerning such momentous events. And yet, even though that evidence is there to be able to discount that, it's not something that is examined. It is not something that is honestly examined to the extent that it should be by our educators, in higher education. This is really, under ideal circumstances, if it were a legitimate enterprise. It would be free from intimidation by the state. That is done in a variety of subtle ways, but it will be able to freely critique these sorts of things. And with that said, there's a very powerful way in which intellectuals, and when I say that, I'm thinking about scholars, political commentators, journalists, they are discouraged from looking into these types of events because they fear being called conspiracy theorists. Right? They fear, this is something that calls into question in a very public way their judgment, their critical faculties. It even goes so far as to suggest that they might not be mentally balanced, that they might somehow be ill in that regard. So this is very damaging for someone's career prospects and things like that, the idea of being called a conspiracy theorist. So that's one of the and even though this is not a formal type of censure. It has done so informally. We now know that the conspiracy theory meme, this very term, was something that was implanted into public discourse in the late 1960s by the Central Intelligence Agency. We look at document 1035-960 that was released to the New York Times in 1977 under a Freedom of Information Act. It states specifically this was something that was addressed to CIA bureau chiefs throughout the world, and media assets as well, meaning journalists that were doing the bidding of the CIA during this period from the beginning of Operation Mockingbird in the early 1950s up through the early 1970s to essentially counter criticism of the Warren Commission report. That was the official narrative of the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the incredible magic bullet theory of the assassination. There was a tremendous amount of criticism that was that was being waged, if you will, that was being assembled and put forth by independent authors, independent journalists for the most part, attorneys such as Mark Lane, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, and they were embarking on their own investigations, arguing that the Warren Commission was not sufficient in terms of really explaining the many irregularities of that event on November 22nd of 1963. So this propaganda campaign was largely waged, and it was something that, again, it continues to this day, but the conspiracy theory term and the notion of being irrational was something that was tied to questioning the Warren report, questioning what really took place with regard to the JFK assassination. So that again is something that is a very, very powerful, I think perhaps more so than people actually realize, a powerful way in which the news media, a commentary, information and so forth are censored. And so people are, there are examples. There's an example of what took place to myself when I questioned the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, the Boston Marathon bombing, which took place. These took place within a course of 5 months between December of 2012 and April of 2013. That there was commentary in the press that highlighted me as being a conspiracy theorist. So therefore, you can't listen to this type of analysis. You can't. You're not able. It's almost a forbidden sort of thing. This is not responsible, even though there is a tremendous amount of information out there in terms of analysis, in terms of photographs, videos, and things, where we should at the very least question these events and events similar to these events. Now, these mass shootings, not everyone, but some of these mass shootings are arguably done for the purposes of propaganda, or they are utilized after the fact in the event that they are authentic for the purposes of further justifying the police state that we presently live in, right? So we have both terrorists from within, in terms of there being unbalanced people who might commit a mass shooting, as well as terrorism from without, in terms of Islamic extremism and things of the like. So there is this state of siege that we saw, for example, from the late 1960s through the 1980s as a result of Operation Gladio in Europe, which sought to denigrate the leftist political movements and parties in many countries in Europe. There is a similar sort of, I would contend, agenda, a set of operations to, at the very least, use these events in a propagandistic way to make the government fearful, to make them accepting of increasing types of police state measures, be they at the airport having to take your shoes off and go through these metal detectors, or these new types of protocols that are now being instituted at schools across North America in terms of drills and other types of precautionary methods, so that young people, students themselves, become in certain ways indoctrinated into this type of mentality where they are ever fearful of the unknown. So they are racked with anxiety and they're uncertain about what is coming next. And they will also, in many cases, defer to authority figures in a very unquestioning sort of way. Educational methods in the U.S. especially have always tended towards that in terms of making workers, industrial workers, more pliant, more efficient, and non-questioning. This is something that is coming in alongside these Common Core initiatives and so forth that tend to really dumb down the educational curriculum. You have these sorts of more or less invisible yet ubiquitous threats from without that tend to keep students from not questioning the way that they actually should.
The Center for Research on Globalization depends on your support. To purchase a book or DVD, or to make a donation, please visit globalresearch.ca today.